Welcome to AP World History Modern podcast for topic 4.5, Maritime Empires Develop. The essential question for this topic: what economic strategies did maritime empires use to increase their power, and how did the developing empires affect political, economic, religious, and cultural dynamics? Okay, some of the big themes of this topic, just to give you an idea. Let's paint a picture here. Maritime empires, they're going to transform commerce from local, small scale, just trading mostly based on like a bartering system. And it's going to go large scale, international trade. And it's going to be using gold and silver. These empires employed new economic models, the following. Okay, joint stock company. Okay, this is where investors finance trade by buying shares in corporations like the East India Company. And it's similar to the stock market now. The support, it raises capital for the entrepreneur. This support, it increased trade in Asia. New ocean trade routes were opened, aiding the rise of this extended global economy. The Atlantic trading system involved the movement of labor, including slaves, and mixing of African America and European cultures and peoples, with all groups contributing to a cultural synthesis. Silver, sugar, and slavery were the keys to the development of these mercantilist empires. That's just some big themes of this topic. Okay, in the 17th century, Europeans generally measured the wealth of a country and how much gold and silver it had in its coffers. We talked about this in the last podcast. This led to countries attempting to sell goods for gold and silver and keep spending at a minimum, right? You're trying to hoard as much gold and silver as you can. The idea is that wealth is static, right? In other words, if I get a bigger slice of pizza, somebody's getting a smaller slice. There's only so much. Okay, the accumulation of capital, material wealth available to produce more wealth in Western Europe grew as entrepreneurs entered long-distance markets. So these long-distance markets are going to change things. As you saw in the book, and you could do a compare and contrast here, laborers are in a better position to become what? To become consumers. And even investors, the quote beginning of this chapter suggests, that should sound familiar. There's some Detroit history for you, right? You could do similarities and differences between this time and Henry Ford and the $5 day. Once Ford workers were able to earn a decent wage, they became what? They became loyal customers. Now they could buy the cars that they were building, right? So there's a little connection there. You see these themes. Anyway, let's get back to it. The transformation of trade-based economy using gold and silver, it's known as the Commercial Revolution. Make sure you know that. It's in big, bold letters in our text. The Commercial Revolution affected all regions of the world and resulted from four key factors. Okay, again, anytime a teacher or your professor starts numbering things, your brain should be going test questions, right? Okay, so four key factors. Commercial Revolution. The development of European overseas colonies is the first one. The second one, the opening of new ocean trade routes. Third, population growth. 4, inflation. We talked about that in the last podcast too with China and silver. Okay, the high rate of inflation or general rise in prices in the 16th and early 17th century is called the Price Revolution. Aiding the rise of this extended global economy was the formation of joint stock companies. So these were owned by investors who bought stock or shares, right, in these companies. There's risk and there's reward. The nice thing about it from an investor standpoint, it was limited liability. So, this may be common sense now if you know how the stock market works. But back then, you weren't responsible for beyond the amount of your investment. So if I buy X amount of shares, say I spend $1,000, right? I buy $1,000 worth of shares. Hopefully, I'm going to double my money, triple my money, quadruple my money. But if I lose, I can't lose more than 1,000. So if the company I invested in, they get in the red for 300 grand, I'm not on the hook for that, right? The guy that started the businesses. The most I can lose is the $1,000. They may come back and tell me my stock's worthless. I lose $1,000, right? All right. The Dutch, the English, and French all developed joint stock companies in the 17th century, including the British East India Company in 1600 and the Dutch East India Company in 1602. So again, you have people starting these companies. They're looking for capital. They're looking to invest, right? It's not that different now. If I took my barbecue catering business and I want to get a building, I want to get a full-blown restaurant, I'm going to need about 2.5 mil. So I could look for investors. I could call some friends, say, hey, man, here's what I got going on, friends in the restaurant business. Either they could help me get the financing or they could buy in themselves. So let's say, that's how you got like a silent partner, right? So they helped me raise capital, right? So if I started a company that was going to go public, meaning there's going to be shares traded, they could have X amount of dollars in shares in my company. The better my company does, their shares go up. Okay, so here's a big theme. Joint stock companies were a driving force behind the development of maritime empires as they allowed continued exploration as well as ventures to colonize and develop the resources of distant lands with limited risk to investors. So again, the limited risk was a nice option. You couldn't lose more than you invested. You're not gonna take on their overall debt. Okay, let's talk about the Dutch, and I'm just going to give you 10 things you need to know about the Dutch, at least as far as AP World History is concerned, right? Okay, 1, they were the commercial middlemen of Europe. 2, they set up and maintained trade routes to Latin America, North America, South Africa, and Indonesia. 3, Dutch ships were faster and lighter than those of their rivals for most of the 17th century. This gave them an early trade advantage. Actually, I think it's going to be 9. Sorry, my bad. 9 things. So 4, the Dutch East India Company was also highly successful as a joint stock company. It made enormous profits in the Spice Islands and Southeast Asia, the Dutch East India Company. 5, pioneers in finance. Dutch had a stock exchange as early as 1602. Okay, 6, by 1609, the Bank of Amsterdam traded currency internationally. They were way ahead of their time. Okay, 7, the Dutch standard of living was the highest in Europe. 8, goods such as diamonds, linen, pottery, tulip bulbs passed through the hands of Dutch traders. So they got their hands on all different types of products, really diversified. And 9, the last one. This isn't in the textbook, but just for clarity, the Dutch really confuses people with, especially if you're going to use this on a DBQ, maybe for the contextualization. Where are the Dutch from? Right? They're from the Netherlands. Now, a lot of people will say Holland. It gets a little confusing. And there's a double standard here, too. North and South Holland are part of the Netherlands. But sometimes people just say Holland for the Netherlands, and technically that's wrong, but it's kind of accepted. Think of like for Great Britain. If you say England, technically England's part of Great Britain. But somehow it's almost kind of allowed to use it interchangeably, even though technically it's not correct. So the Dutch, they're from the Netherlands. And you might hear some people say, no, they're not. They're from Holland. Well, North and South Holland, they're part of the Netherlands. So kind of, Google map that if you get a second. a decent map will it'll make sense real quick. So Google Map that if you can. Okay, so next I want to talk about triangular trade. Okay, I want 10 things you need to know about triangular trade. And I think this time I'm going to actually stick to 10. I'm not going to end up with 9. Okay, triangular trade is the topic. 10 things you should know about triangular trade. Number 1, Europe wants enslaved workers in the Americas. We talked about this. If they had their druthers, they could have enslaved the Indians, right? The Native Americans. They could have enslaved the tribes. And, they could have in Mexico, the Aztecs, the Tlaxcalans, etc. But between the smallpox, killing half of them, and them knowing their territory, they could escape and blend in, and it was hard to find. They just had all kinds of problems enslaving the people that were already there, the indigenous people. So because of these issues, they have to look elsewhere. Where do they look? They're going to look to Africa. So Portugal discovers, right? Anytime you hear that word discover, you know what's coming next, right? Portugal discovers West Africa. So when Europeans are discovering a new land, people are going to die. They're going to get raped. They're going to get their goods taken from them. They're going to get their culture ripped away from them, right? Okay, 3, enslaved Africans become a part of a complex Atlantic trading system known as the triangular trade. 4, it was called the triangular trade because voyages often had 3 segments. Okay, 5, a ship might carry European manufactured goods such as firearms to West Africa. So you're in Europe, you're loaded up with guns, you're taking them to West Africa. Then when you get to West Africa, you're going to sell the guns, and then you're going to take enslaved Africans to the Americas. You're not going back to Europe yet. You're taking them to the Americas. When you get to the Americas, you sell the slaves, you unload them. Then you load up with sugar and tobacco to take back to Europe. Okay, that's 7. 8, sugar was the most profitable good from the Americas. That was 8. 9, by the 1700s, Caribbean sugar production and rum, which was made from sugar, were financing fortunes in Britain, and to a lesser extent in France and the Netherlands. And 10 things you should know about triangular trade. Know what it looked like. This is another one where a map really tells the story. So put some eyeballs on the triangular trade map on page 234 of our AMSCO text. That can kind of help you understand it. And that, that kind of thing would really lend itself to a DBQ as a document. And the thing with the guns, why they were selling guns real quick. They're selling guns to a lot of these Western, villages, empires, if you will. Because if they have guns, they can be more successful raiding neighboring villages and getting more slaves to bring to the coast to give to the Portuguese and other Europeans. Okay, our next topic, rivalries for the Indian Ocean trade. The Portuguese, they defeat Muslim and Venetian forces in a naval battle. Remember that the Portuguese were really good at maritime trade. However, not so good on land. They get crushed by Moroccan forces on land in 1578. So the Portuguese kind of need to stay in their lane. They're out of their element when they're on land. Right? That's a good thing to remember. The Spanish and the Portuguese are going to soon control much of this area. Okay, 7 things you should know about change and continuities in trade networks. Again, AP World History Modern, very thematic, right? So change, continuities, trade networks, these are big buzzwords in AP World History. So 1, here's a big theme. Trading networks involve the new global circulation of goods, wealth, and labor. 2, silver from the Spanish colonies in the Americas flowed to where? You should know this already. To Asia. 3, Asians were eager to trade goods such as what? You should know this too. Silk, porcelain, and steel products for silver. 4. One-way patterns of trade were maintained. One way they were maintained was through monopolies chartered by European rulers. 5. Monopolies granted certain merchants exclusive right to trade. And here's an example of a monopoly. Number 6. The Spanish government established a tobacco monopoly from its American colonies. The profits from this monopoly greatly enriched the Spanish government. So if you got a monopoly, you're getting huge profits because you don't have any what? You don't have any competition, right? At least for that particular product that you've monopolized. You've cornered the market. Okay, 7. The income from tobacco in Spain made up about 1/3 of total revenue. So they're killing it on tobacco and having a monopoly. That term monopoly, if you remember from your U.S. history class, you should have examined that political cartoon with Standard Oil Company and the octopus. Remember J.D. Rockefeller having his tentacles around Washington, D.C.? And they're going to have trust busters, right? Like Teddy Roosevelt. They're going to bust up these monopolies. They're going to make monopolies illegal, right? Because you get way too much power. So monopolies, you should have a background on monopolies. But at this time, there's no Teddy Roosevelt here saying, I'm going to bust this up. It's illegal. Okay, next. I'm going to give you 13 examples of how the Atlantic slave trade affected Africa. 1. The Atlantic slave trade weakened several West African kingdoms, such as the Congo. 2. The loss of so many people slowed population growth. 3. Trade competition led to violence among their societies. 4. African slave-raiding kingdoms became economically dependent on goods from Europe. 5. Such societies were slow to develop more complex economies in which they produced their own goods. 6. The slave trade set the stage for European conquest and imperialism of the late 19th century. 7. African societies that conducted slave raids, such as the Dahomey and the Oyo, became richer from selling their captives to Europeans. So you have these African societies conducting these slave raids on their neighbors, and they're getting rich off of it. And number 8, this trade also had political effects, because when a society, this African societies, when they exchanged slaves for guns, its raiders took advantage of rival societies that had no firearms. So they get a huge advantage. We have guns and you don't. Raiding societies became richer and more powerful with firearms, right? That makes sense, right? Number 9, those most affected by the slave trade were the peoples and civilizations of West Africa. It's present-day Ghana and Benin, from which most Africans were kidnapped or sold. 10. Gender distributions in those regions became severely imbalanced because more than 2/3 of those taken were male. 11. The resulting predominance of women prompted a rise in polygyny, or polygamy, taking of more than one wife, and forced women to assume duties that had traditionally been men's jobs, right? 12. While the Atlantic trading system weakened Africa in many ways, it also ultimately spurred population growth through an improved diet. For all the horrible, horrible things that happened with the slave trade, there's one thing that was kind of positive for Africans. The Columbian Exchange introduced new crops to the continent, such as the American crops of maize, corn, peanuts, cassava, which became staples in the African diet. That was 13. Okay, I want to talk about political and cultural changes for indigenous peoples. Okay, 1. The Spanish and Portuguese empires managed to erase the basic social structures and many of the cultural traditions of the indigenous Americans within a century of when the first European explorers arrived. Again, we've talked about this in class, right? People in Italy speak Italian. People in Japan speak Japanese. People in Mexico speak Mexican. Nope, they speak Spanish. This is what we're talking about here. Their old religions, gone, right? They took on the religion of their conquerors, which was Christianity, more specifically, in most cases, Catholicism. So to this day, you go to Mexico, odds are you run into somebody, they speak Spanish and they're Catholic. Okay, 2. European actions nearly depopulated the Americas. Again, unintentional germ warfare. At least at first it was unintentional. Smallpox. 3. Indigenous political structures in Latin America were soon replaced by Spanish and Portuguese colonial administrations. So you're not just, killing these people. You're erasing their history and you're ending it. And, again, the effects of this to this day, right? Number 4, Spanish royalty appointed viceroys to act as administrators and representatives of the Spanish crown. So these viceroys there to make sure things are running the way Spain wants it to run. 5, Spain establishes audiencias or royal courts to which Spanish settlers could appeal viceroys' decisions or policies. Spanish settlers, right? 6, slow transportation and communication networks between Europe and the Americas, however, made it difficult for the Spanish crowns to exercise direct control over New Spain. So proximity is an issue. The long distance is an issue. We've talked about this before, during maritime trade, people going around the government. It's hard to enforce all this stuff. Okay, 7. As a result, the Spanish throne did not focus on the colonial affairs in the Western Hemisphere. It's kind of too far. It's kind of too impractical. You couldn't really micromanage it. You could barely macromanage it. Okay, let's talk about some cultural changes. Okay, this is our next topic. The indigenous peoples of the Americas lost a great deal of their culture and history at the hands of conquerors. Conquistadors such as Cortez in Mexico ordered the burning of native books which were thought to be unholy. So this is where you're erasing their culture, right? This is why their descendants now, it's 2020, they don't even know, right? It was destroyed. Thus, very few original accounts written in native languages, such as the Aztec, exist today. It's just gone. Spanish and Portuguese conquerors transplanted their own languages and religion into the Americas. And again, this is present today. Although indigenous languages thrive in certain regions, if you go to Guatemala, the mountains in Mexico, for example, but outside of that, Spanish dominates much of Latin America, and in Brazil, overwhelmingly, what language they speak in Brazil? They speak Portuguese right now in 2020, right? So effects of belief systems. The increase in intensity of newly established global connections between hemispheres extended the reach of existing religions. In some areas, the new connections contributed to the development of the syncretic belief systems and practices. In other areas, the connections contributed to religious conflicts. So let's talk about syncretic belief systems in the Americas. What does this mean? It's like a merging, right? You might have some of your old traditions merging with this religion that your conquerors have brought, right? African religions in the Americas provide powerful examples of religious syncretism, or the combining of different religious beliefs and practices. Africans melded aspects of Christianity, which was usually Roman Catholic, and their West African religious traditions. You had Santeria, which means the way of the saints. You had Vodun, meaning spirit or deity. You had Candomblé, which means dance to honor the gods. Maybe, think of the Virgin of Guadalupe, a combination of beliefs that existed and ones that were brought on by the conquerors, right? About 1 in 10 of the enslaved Africans, they practiced Islam. While some of the men who sailed with Columbus may have been Muslims, these enslaved Africans become the first significant presence of Islam in the Americas. Several Catholic religious orders in Europe, such as the Dominicans, the Jesuits, the Franciscans, they're going to send missionaries to Latin America to convert people to Christianity. So you see this common theme, right? After they steal your gold or your precious metals, after they kill half of you, rape your women, they introduce what? Christianity. Very ironic and tragic. The missionaries were so successful that today most Latin Americans are Roman Catholic Christians. Examples of religious syncretism originated in the Spanish colonies. Numerous examples originated. We talked about the Virgin of Guadalupe, Afro-Eurasia. Global interactions are intensifying. The famous split between the Sunni and the Shia Muslims worsened. Between the Ottoman and the Safavid empires. Remember, we talked about them. And I just want to use an outside source here. A lot of the stuff we're covering right now, just full disclosure, I was, baptized Catholic down at St. Gabe's on Verner. So it's really, it's really tough to read some of this stuff. And when you see, the history of, what's happened to these indigenous peoples. But if you're interested in looking at this a little further, there's a new book out that I'm reading right now for one of my book clubs. It's called Horizon by Barry Lopez. It's still in hardcover. You can't get it in paperback yet. It's just an exceptional book. It's like a travel log. It's history. It's sociology. It's philosophy. Excellent book. And I think I picked a good time to read this. It's kind of coinciding with our AP class. But I just want to read an excerpt out of this. The coin reminds me that the urge to condemn the conquistadors and other miscreants in world history, the witless, avaricious mobs who followed the leads of the Genghis Khans, the Pizarros, the Trujillos, might be countered today by refusing to define as evil any other culture, or even the wayward in our own. If we don't, we risk ending up in a wasteland of uninformed dogmatists, the same short-sighted, narrow-minded belligerents who rise up in every era of human history. That's on page 78 of Horizon, a new book by Barry Lopez. If this kind of stuff interests you, I highly recommend this book. I'm about 200 pages in so far, and I'm really liking it. I think reading this book as we take our AP World History class, I think they complements each other really well. Okay, so that's it for this topic. I know we got to study for an AP exam, but again, it's a survey course. There's so many good books out there. You can, if you want to do a deep dive on any of these topics, please feel free to ask me for a recommended reading list, etc. All right, see you next time.